Philosophy of Nature, lecture number 8. Almost to the end. I mean, if at this point you don't have even a paper topic, you should probably be panicking. Your paper is due next week, on the day of class 9 by midnight on Moodle. Just upload it in the Dropbox there. Please make sure you've run your paper topic by me. I'm sure this came up in the discussion sections before this now. Run it by me. Long story short, pick something that you thought was interesting in this quarter's class, one of the texts, one of the lectures, and say something about it, something interesting, something sort of original. Think about it on your own. Compare two of the thinkers, say maybe Aquinas, the way he phrases something, the way he does something compared to Aristotle's. Write about Genesis, write about Enuma Elish, something about Galileo, Descartes. Just something on the topic, broadly speaking. Quote the text. Make sure you actually sort of think about it in a sort of independent way. Write a little outline for yourself, even if it's 5-6 lines. Use section headings to organize it so you can show me that that you thought about this before you just started writing. And develop an idea. It's a really short paper, 4 to 6 pages. It doesn't have to be like this totally developed thing. When you quote the reader, which you must do. If there's no quotes, just go rewrite it or something like that. But when you quote Descartes or something like that, you don't have to go and find some actual source. You can just quote the reader, put it in a little footnote, reader page, whatever, or in parentheses. I'm not really worried about any stuff like that. Find a font that's reasonable. Times New Roman is fine. Double space it. Don't try to stretch the thing out with huge margins or extra spacing. I've seen all that. I've done all that. Just write a paper. Give me your thoughts. Turn it in. Please don't ask for an extension. It's like the only thing you have to do for the class. It seems fair that you get it turned in on time. If you're just panicking, you have no idea what to write on, we'll talk about it in class when I see you this week. Anyway, so that's the paper. Next week, we'll talk about Heisenberg in his couple essays. I'm hoping it'll be sort of a shortish recording, but I guess time will tell. 2 weeks from now is your final exam. I will tell you about the details about that in class when I see you. On class 9 next week, when I see you, I will give you an opportunity to ask me any questions you want before the final exam. And the final exam is non-cumulative. So from after the midterm onward. So Galileo, and just like the midterm, it will only be selected from these questions on page 305 and 306. So if you have a decent answer, if you're able to sort of answer these pretty well, you'll do fine on the final. If not, next week is going to be your time to ask clarifying questions on that. All right? So today we're going to talk about evolution. I just want to tell you up front, ever since I was like a little kid, I really did not think this was... I think evolution itself was kind of an interesting thing to talk about, the sort of mechanisms of it and things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit today. But the sort of topic of how does evolution coincide with either the Aristotelian sort of physics that we talked about earlier in today's class, or sort of religion or Christianity in general. How can both of them be true? How can we reconcile the two? Certainly the question about the book of Genesis and whether it's meant to be interpreted literally, we're going to see how Aquinas really does not do that. There are spots where he sort of says we should give preference to the literal interpretation of Scripture, but I'm going to show you where he literally says, yeah, but if that doesn't work for any reason, especially if it seems to go against reason itself, if it can be shown that interpretation is false with reason, then you abandon that interpretation. He just says, and that's regarding the book of Genesis and its interpretation regarding the days of creation. So I don't think Aquinas would have had any problem. St. Augustine, way before him, and Aquinas is quoting him, didn't even try to interpret the book of the days of creation literally. He has an entirely symbolic interpretation of the days of of creation. So back to the sentence that began this. Even ever since I was a kid, I really did not think that was an interesting question or something to be upset about. And I really don't even want to teach it in this class, but it's something that a lot of people just kind of freak out about. So I figure I might as well spend a little time on it. So we'll start with some questions on Darwin, just sort of clarifying some of these kind of mechanisms behind, or like terms behind evolution. I'm also not going to get into the science. If you're like, oh, I have like scientific objections to Darwin, not even like religious basis, I'm going to kind of half roll my eyes and I'm going to let you deal with that. People make a big deal about between micro and macro evolution. Micro evolution is where within a species things can adapt or change. Macro evolution would be one species evolving into another. I don't care about that. It's not an interesting thing to me. I don't think either one is a problem. If you have there are some biologists that, I don't know how like popular or well respected they are, but there are some biologists that have questions about it. Certainly there are philosophical and scientific issues that have not been ironed out regarding evolution. It's not my field. I'm not going to get into it. If you think it's interesting, if you want to write your paper on that for whatever reason, go ahead. That's fine. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to give you sort of just a couple of basic ideas, what natural selection is, things like that. And then we'll get into the more philosophical sort of question and sort of theological question of how to read the text of Genesis and how that can be, I think, pretty easily reconciled with evolution. All right? That's what we're going to do today. Okay. I'm going to start with the Darwin questions. I'm actually going to start with number 24. I'm not going to answer that question. I actually don't like the way I phrased it. What do you think about Darwin's idea of natural selection? I'm not going to tell you what you think about it. I'm actually not that worried about what you think about it. I'll give you a basic description of it, and then you can think about it what you wish. Then I'll go back to, I'll do 25 after that, and then I'll probably jump back up to 23, because it's part of number 25. So number 24, natural selection. So just sort of describe it. You probably already have a pretty good idea of this, and there are many more competent people than I am to describe this. But the basic idea of natural selection is that there is a limited amount of food or resources, food, water, other things, on the earth, just in any given area. And potentially the number of living things could be enormous, way more than can be sustained by the nourishment that's available in any given area. Why is it potentially enormous, potentially even infinite? Because of the way reproduction works. Because many animals or plants or living things, they will reproduce in decently large numbers. Even if an organism reproduces just 2 more than itself. Okay. That's over time, and it's not that long a time, over just a few generations, that 2, and if that 2 reproduces 2 more, it can be just enormous. So the sort of numbers that, you just sort of keep squaring everything, become so big, and I just want you to sort of imagine like a box, just sort of there's walls that there's limited resources, and then there's an organism, even just one organism, that is reproducing at a very normal sort of moderate rate. It's going to fill up that box and hit the walls very quickly. And what does it mean to hit the walls? It means it's going to use up all the resources that are available, whatever that might be. And then if you add more and more organisms, more types of organisms, they're all going to be sort of competing for the same resources in any given area. And therefore, there's going to be a competition for them, because those who don't get to the resources are going to die. So those organisms that are better at getting those resources, in whatever way that might be, are going to reproduce and better able to defend themselves and to survive long enough to reproduce in the first place. Those organisms are going to be able to reproduce more, and they're going to be able to sort of survive better, and there's going to be more of them. And over time, those organisms that aren't able to do that are gradually going to die away. Okay, so it's called the survival of the fittest, is one of the phrases he used there. Natural selection is another word he uses. So competition over these resources, limited resources, almost unlimited reproduction theoretically, and then once you hit the wall, there's going to be competition. So what's going to happen? There's going to be more of those organisms that are able to survive better, and those that don't are going to die off. Now, what's missing here, and this is something that I think 20th century evolutionary biologists helped solve, there's also needed to sort of fill in that picture mutation of some kind. So at some point, an organism is going to reproduce, and its offspring is going to have some mutation that it didn't have. For example, longer teeth or something like that on a tiger or something. And the one that has longer teeth, that has that mutation of longer teeth, maybe it's going to survive better. And because it's going to survive better, it's going to be able to reproduce more, and and then it's going to pass on that gene in some cases to its offspring, and its offspring are going to be able to reproduce more, and so on. And gradually that one's going to take over. So on with whatever other sort of, a taller tree or a giraffe with a longer neck or whatever. Okay. And another part that we need to sort of have in mind as we're imagining this is over the course of millions of years, or at least hundreds of thousands of years. It's not going to be something that we're just going to observe. Oh, wow, that tree. And then when we turn 10 years old, we're going to see a tree that has some mutation. And then when we turn 15, it's not going to be something that we're going to be able to observe sort of during our lifetime. But looking into the geological record over the course of history, that we can sort of, the deeper we dig, the sort of further back in time we can see, and we observe, the fossils, that whole picture that you guys all probably know from your high school biology class, that gives us the picture of how this all sort of works. Okay, so that's a more or less very kind of dumb, poor man's version of how natural selection works. You read the text. I'm not going to go further than that. Because there are much smarter people than I am when it comes to these questions. Now, how does he summarize the objections? So if you want to sort of see where that is, more or less, it's on page 202, is where he begins to describe that. Now, what about these objections? He has, on page 206, he has the conclusion of The Origin of Species, where he summarizes a lot, and you can sort of see a lot of his ideas summarized there. And then he talks about many and grave objections that can be advanced against the theory of descent with modification through natural selection. So he goes through and talks about these objections. Now, there are some of them that are just sort of just thoroughly answered, I think, in the generations that came after him. And I think some he answers himself pretty well. But there's the one that I want to spend most time on. Actually, there's two that I want to just spend a little time just kind of summarizing. One is the one that's connected to number 23, between a species and a variety. There's a difference between a species and a variety, at least in Darwin's time, that is in the biological sort of literature of the time is an absolute difference. So what is a variety? A variety is the sort of type of dog you have. You have a collie or you have a Doberman. Those are varieties of the same species of house dog, or whatever the name of a dog is, the sort of technical name of a dog. So house dog, let's say, is a species. Within that species, there are many, many, many varieties that human beings have bred for our purposes. In fact, that's a way we can sort of almost sort of witness evolution kind of happening, at least in some form, at least breeding of certain qualities. Okay. Now, why is this sort of an important difference that Darwin needs to sort of dismiss? Well, because different varieties of the same species, by definition, can reproduce with each other. So if you have a Doberman and you have a collie, theoretically, I don't know if this is actually done, it'd be a weird looking dog, but you could breed them and their offspring would have traits from each variety. So what is it that makes something a species, the same species, that you can breed the two animals together, and this is a sort of important note, that their offspring are fertile? If the offspring of the two is fertile, that's an indication that they're members of the same species. Just sort of understanding what the term means. If the offspring is sterile, if the offspring is not able to have offspring, to reproduce, then you don't have a species. They're not members of the same species. These are just sort of technical terms. Now, what's an example of that? You can take a lion and a tiger and, give them some wine and play some Barry White or something like that, and they can reproduce, and they can have a liger. And I think you can have a liger where one of the parents is a tiger and one is a lion, and then if you switch them, there's a tigun or something like that. So, and they each are sort of different kinds of animals. And in those cases, where you have a lion and a tiger breeding, their offspring, their male offspring, this gets very technical here, but their male offspring, in that particular case, is sterile. It can't have, it can't make more of itself. The female, in some of those cases, is fertile, but the male is not, and therefore that's not a species. A liger is not a species. A mule is a horse and a donkey. Again, you get them in the right mood and whatever, you take them to the club, and then one thing leads to another, and then they have, so a horse and a donkey have a mule offspring. Mules are sterile; they cannot have kids, so a mule is not a species. Okay, and therefore horses and donkeys are not varieties of the same species. Okay, so that's what a species is, and that's what so a horse and a mule are different species. A horse and a donkey are different species. Two breeds of horse, though, are the same species. They're just different varieties, and their offspring will be fertile. All right? Those are technical terms. Now, why does Darwin need to dismiss this difference, or at least be able to sort of grapple with it and explain what's going on there? Well, because that seems to show that a species is a thing that is, like, built into nature. How can a species how can something evolve from one species into another species if species seems to be sort of locked in that they can only reproduce with themselves? So it seems that difference between a species and variety and what it means for reproduction seems to imply that there's something wrong with the theory of evolution. Darwin needs to deal with it. It's something that he needs to deal with. Now, how does he deal with it, or how does evolutionary biology in general deal with it? Well, it's a kind of, I think, pretty good explanation. It's a pretty simple explanation. It's not that there are these things that are species that are eternally there, and or maybe that God created from the beginning, and that's it. It's that over time, those different varieties became so distant from each other, whether they just were in different parts of the world for whatever reason, or they sort of kind of lived on their own and they only reproduced themselves, and those varieties kept evolving long enough so that they continued to mutate, so that in reproduction they were no longer compatible. Okay, I think that does explain it. I think that sort of takes care of that problem. Okay, now one thing that I don't think is very easy, or is as easy philosophically to deal with, and I think this is a legitimate philosophical problem that an Aristotelian philosopher would need to sort of think about if he wants to grapple with this, is that in Aristotle, if you remember, form, substantial form, is a thing that defined the kind of being you are, and that implies that species is sort of an important thing. Whereas if evolutionary biology is the right picture and sort of the full picture of how animals or plants or living things came about, it seems to suggest that there really aren't species. Species really isn't a thing in nature. It really is just sort of a mental category that we sort of are organizing things that we notice. Now, there are different ways to approach this, and I'm actually not going to even attempt to solve it here. I just want to sort of make you aware of the problem. I kind of want you to think about this on your own. So in my reading, I actually think there's a bigger problem. I think evolution is a bigger problem for an Aristotelian philosopher than it is for the book of Genesis. Okay, that's just my claim. Somebody might agree or disagree with me on it, but I don't think, I'm going to show you where I don't think it's an issue for Genesis. It's more an issue for those who sort of need species to be a really serious. Now, in the book of Genesis, it does say, there's a line that says, God made the animals according to their kinds. So you do have to sort of deal with that. But again, I think in Genesis, it's easy. He made them according to their kinds over time. And their kinds, here's one way that I would sort of suggest maybe you could sort of approach the topic. A kind doesn't have to be necessarily an eternal type. There can be kinds that evolve over time and that are there for a time. And then when they die out, that kind is not there anymore. I think you don't need to have, I don't think species has to be an eternal thing. I don't think it even has to be a thing in the mind of God. I think individual beings that God creates over time are the sort of reference to the divine ideas. You have to have sort of, God has this model that he's making these. I don't think that has to be an issue. I think when it comes to Genesis and to sort of Catholicism in general, we do have to sort of deal with the human species in a special way. I don't think that's the biggest problem in the world from either side. When it comes to other things, I mean, if you ask me to think of a horse as its own kind of thing, and that's totally different from a donkey, who cares? It's not something that I really think is very important or interesting. And if they came about over time and they're different, and I'm perfectly fine calling them two types of being right now. And what is it that makes them types? Well, this breeding issue or other things that have to do with species and the distinctions between them. And it's here for a time. And before, maybe their ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago could breed and have fertile offspring, and now they can't. That's okay with me. I don't think philosophically, as an Aristotelian, I don't see a problem with that. I'm perfectly fine with saying, as it is right now, I'm going to observe things in nature. I don't think I'm imposing categorizations entirely. I think I'm looking at what's really there, and I think we can name species the way biologists name species. And I think that's a perfectly valid way to do science. Okay? And I don't think Aristotle would have had a problem with any of that. Though Aristotle did believe that each species of animal was eternally there and has always been around. He didn't believe in evolution, though he seemed to have been aware of it because of Empedocles, who had a sort of primordial, kind of like proto-theory of evolution. Aristotle didn't teach this. I would guess, I'm going to sort of do what Galileo did. I would guess that if Aristotle knew what we knew, he would be fine with it, and he would have sort of adjusted accordingly. All right. So now that's one way that Darwin replies to the difference between a species and variety, or evolutionary biology at least has done that. Darwin himself doesn't, he kind of fumbles on this one, philosophically speaking. One of the objections you can find in page 208, on page 208 and what follows, is that other natural philosophers of his time, evolutionary biologists in our term, of his time, pointed out, because this was kind of a revolutionary theory at Darwin's time, pointed out, look, the geological record doesn't show this. And they're right at the time. That the geological record, and to some degree they're right now, but I think it's a different story slightly now. The geological record doesn't really show a species evolving into another species. It shows that there's a species, and then later in time we have another species. We don't really have a lot of direct evidence of the stuff in between. And to some degree that's true. Now, how does Darwin respond to that? You can see it in the pages that I noted. He says, well, the geological record is imperfect, which is true, and it only gives us sort of snapshots. It's sort of like, imagine taking a photograph only once every, I don't know, you know, those Instagram things that people do, they'll take a picture of themselves every single day. So like every day you have one snapshot of like 1 second every 24 hours. The geological record is analogous to that every so often, whatever, 10,000 years or something, it'll sort of give you a layer that's a year of that 10,000 years. Something like that. Don't quote me on the numbers, please. Okay. And so Darwin's saying, like, look, that's the way the geological record works. How can we expect it to show what it really isn't capable of showing, which is the stuff in between? So that's fair enough. Now, why is that, like, not as satisfactory as we would want it to be? Because he's sort of saying, well, the evidence isn't there, but if there was more evidence, it would prove me right. There's a couple of lines where he kind of says that. I mean, I think he's probably right about that, but I don't think it's philosophically the best argument. It's kind of like, okay, well, anybody can say that. If only there were more evidence, of course, it would prove me right. Well, if you don't really know that, and that's the whole point of how evidence works. So I wouldn't call it exactly a huge flaw in his thinking, but it is just kind of like a lame answer, but whatever. There are different ways to deal with that, biologically speaking, even aside from the sort of, well, the in-between is not there. But again, it's not my field. I'm not going to get into that. There is something called, I think it's called graduated equilibrium, where it's an evolutionary theory. I don't know how serious it's taken. Again, it's not my field. It's not really something I'm interested in. Where they'll say evolution itself doesn't work in the sort of smooth line where these species gradually change, but there are just periods where just like a whole bunch of crap just happens all at the same time and just sort of jumps, and these differences in species kind of all happen in a kind of more surprising kind of spontaneous way. It doesn't seem very plausible to me. The other way seems more plausible to me, but like I said, it's not my field, so not going to get much into it. What role does sexual selection play in the evolution of human beings, according to Darwin? I mean, you can see this on page 234. It's kind of funny, and I think he might be onto something here. Middle of page 234. A lot of the stuff that can't be explained according to survival, he sort of claims can be explained through sexual selection. What's sexual selection? It's the sort of more arbitrary things that make males and females attracted to each other that are not really directly related to survival. So, you guys are like in your early 20s or late teens or whatever. The things that you find attractive about each other, in some cases, I think have a sort of biological basis. I don't know, physical traits, somebody being taller, or have it like a male having wider shoulders or a woman having wider hips or something like that. Maybe there's some biological, maybe the shoulders sort of make you they evoke somebody who's more able to protect you from the lions and tigers or something like that. Maybe the wider hips would evoke somebody who's more able to bear healthy children or something like that. I don't know. So there might be some sort of natural survival basis for the things we find attractive about each other, but other things, no. And how do those other things evolve and sometimes become more predominant than others if they really seem pretty disconnected directly from survival itself, which is the sort of fundamental mechanism of evolution? Well, sexual selection, which is the stuff that we find attractive that really isn't about that. And so maybe eye color. I don't know how eye color would be related to survival. Maybe it is. I don't know. Or other things like that. Maybe symmetry in the face is apparently one of the most universally accepted sort of attractive things about human beings. Or whatever. Other maybe color issues that really don't really have much to do to survival, but they evolve because they're sort of considered attractive for some other reason. And that's the sort of explanation of how one can be more common than the other. All right, seems plausible enough. All right, what I'm not going to do, except to sort of point it out in a kind of snarky way, is get to the really, really not politically correct stuff that Darwin does. For example, page 235, he basically talks about eugenics. Page 235 at the top. The advancement of the welfare of mankind is a most intricate problem. Everyone ought to refrain from marriage who cannot avoid poverty for their children. He says we should basically sterilize poor people. Horrible. Friggin' terrible. He says that 234 at the bottom. If somebody's inferior in body or mind, they should refrain from marriage. Horrible. So, okay, there, dude, stay in your friggin' lane and shut up. That's a really nasty thing to say. Richard Dawkins, like right now, on like a couple days ago on Twitter, was attempting to defend his own opinion that it is morally wrong to not abort a baby that has Down syndrome. Like, it's a sin to not abort them. He wouldn't use the word sin, but he would say it's morally wrong. And he was defending it a couple days ago, and he's an evolutionary biologist. I just want you guys to know he did not get that out of nowhere. He learned that from Darwin. Is considered a hero by many scientists, but the guy had he's problematic in our terminology. In fact, he on 236 he just gets outright racist. 235 at the bottom and 236, he basically says he would much rather be descended from a monkey than from some of the barbarian tribes that he's seen in his travels. Fugians, I don't know how to pronounce that, bottom of 235. So that's terrible. Whatever. Okay. Nobody's perfect, I guess. I don't know. Okay, so let's move to the Aquinas. Okay, so this selection of Aquinas, I do want to say some of these questions that are at, on page 306 are actually based on another text of Aquinas that I used to use in this class a long time ago, from his book called De Potentia Dei, on the power of God. Those earlier works of Aquinas are way more extensive and really long, and they'll be, instead of like 2 or 3 objections, there'll be like 30-something objections and like 20-something on the contraries. And like a single article will go on for like 50 pages. So I gave you a couple of questions from the Summa Theologica, or Theologiae, that are a lot more concise. So you're welcome for that. But this is from his commentary on the book of Genesis. So what he's saying here is literally about the book of Genesis. So don't let anybody... Now, whereas Aquinas, this is the only thing that's out of historical order in this class, Aquinas is 600 years before Darwin. So this is not in response. This is not like a Catholic thinker desperately scrambling to try to save the faith from the devastating attack of Richard Dawkins still, of Charles Darwin. This is somebody doing biblical scholarship in the Middle Ages, when the church was frickin' in charge of everything. This is somebody just thinking clearly, reading the Bible, coming to the conclusions that, oh yeah, this days of creation stuff is not supposed to be taken literally. Okay, that's Thomas Aquinas. This is not liberal someone so and so secularist so and so. Okay, so let's start. Let's go with page 251. I just want to give you an example of how Aquinas himself is not really doing anything radical here. 251 at the top. So whether it was fitting that the gathering together of the waters should take place is recorded on the 3rd day. I don't really care much about that particular question, but let's take a look at how he says. I answer that it is necessary to reply differently to this question according to the different interpretations given by Augustine and other holy writers. So this is not just Aquinas, it's Aquinas quoting St. Augustine and other holy writers. I think one of the Gregories, and I think it's St. Basil the Great. So these are like very, very like well-respected 3rd, 4th century fathers of the church and their commentaries on Genesis. So according to Augustine, so there's 2 different interpretations. One is Augustine's, and the other one is the other sort of fathers of the church, which in this work he doesn't cite, but he does cite in the longer works. In all these works, according to Augustine, there's no order of duration, but only order of origin and nature. According to St. Augustine, the 6 days have nothing to do with time. The 6 days are only symbols, and they are symbols for what's worse, what's less important, and what's more important in creation. Saint Thomas Aquinas, the universal doctor of the church, quoting St. Augustine, one of the greatest doctors of the church of Catholicism, saying the 6 days of creation have absolutely nothing to do with time. There is no order of duration. Okay. I really want to push this because people have this really weird scrambled idea in their mind that if you don't accept Genesis literally, you're like an unfaithful Catholic or something like that. Quite the contrary. Okay. He says that the formless spiritual and formless corporeal natures were created first of all, and latter. Augustine gives a different order than Genesis does. Not that this formlessness preceded formation in time, but only in origin. Yet that one formation preceded another in duration, nor yet that one formation preceded another in duration, but merely in the order of nature. What's the order of nature? Better and worse, according to Augustine. Has nothing to do with this happened first, and then the next day this happened. Days are not literal days, according to St. Augustine, quoted by Thomas Aquinas. Next paragraph, though. Let's just show you that there's other ways to read this. According, however, to other holy writers, an order of duration in works is to be understood, by which is meant that the formlessness of matter precedes its formation, and one from another in order of time. So there is another school of thought that says, yeah, the 6 days have to do with time. They don't ever say that it has to do with that it's an exact 24-hour day. Okay, I'm not aware of any father of the church that teaches that. And again, and I repeat something I said, I think on the first day of class, what the heck is a 24-hour day when the sun isn't created until the fourth day? I think that's just a dumb reading of the book of Genesis to say that. Nevertheless, they do not hold that the formlessness of matter implies the total absence of form because of the whole issue with prime matter can't exist on itself. I'm going to let you read the rest of that. I mean, that he gives an idea of what it means, what sort of duration in time might mean. But again, it has nothing to do with sort of 24-hour days. All right, so that's just the two. That's number 27. How does he summarize the Father's interpretation of the 6 days of creation? What are the two views? Those are the two views. Okay. Go to page 239. Towards the beginning of your reading. 237 at the bottom, sorry. 237 at the bottom. Whether the firmament was made on the second day, again, not something I'm terribly interested in, but I answer that in discussing questions of this kind. Two rules are to be observed. What are the two rules, as Augustine teaches? So again, he's quoting Augustine. And by the way, Augustine's work that he's quoting is called His Literal Interpretation of Genesis. His literal interpretation of Genesis is that you should not take this literally. Okay. Rule number 1, hold the truth of Scripture without wavering. I believe without wavering that the Scripture is true. The second is that, since Holy Scripture can be explained in a multiplicity of senses, one should adhere to a particular explanation only in such measure as to be ready to abandon it if it be proved with certainty to be false, lest Holy Scripture be exposed to the ridicule of unbelievers and obstacles be placed to their believing. Rule number 1 is, the Bible is true. Rule number 2 is, I'm only going to accept an interpretation of Scripture to a degree that I can abandon it readily if it's proven false. So accept the Scriptures unwaveringly, but do not unwaveringly accept any interpretation that might be proven to be false. And if it is proven false, let it go. Like that frickin' movie that the little kids like to watch. Okay? Abandon that interpretation if it is proved with certainty to be false. Certainty is not this absolute term for Aquinas. There's relative degrees of certainty too. And what's his reason to do this? Because non-believers might make fun of the faith and the Bible, and you're going to place an obstacle to their believing by your holding to an interpretation of Scripture that is dumb. I think that is exactly what is happening with creationists today, demanding that we read the book of Genesis literally. They're going directly against Augustine and Aquinas' rules. Directly against it. Okay. And again, he's saying this in the context of a commentary on the book of Genesis. Right? I really want to push this because I don't get why people are push back against this. Who cares? We're gonna let people mock the resurrection of Christ because we're demanding that I don't know what dinosaur bones were created by Satan and hid to trick people. What is wrong with you? Sorry, I'm yelling at somebody I invented in my head right now. Okay, although there are people like that. Okay. Page 239. End of the first paragraph at the top. It could not be made out of matter existing antecedently in time. This is not about succession in time. I'm just going to jump two paragraphs later. If, however, we take these days to denote merely sequence in the natural order and not succession in time. St. Basil, the next paragraph down towards the end. If then this explanation is adopted, none of these opinions will be found repugnant to reason. Augustine, in fact, recommends it. Thus, I consider this view of the question worthy of all commendation, as neither contrary to faith nor difficult to be proved and believed. Okay. Reason is the sort of reference point to accept or deny these things. Okay, what did I just answer? I answered something here. How does Thomas interpret the biblical text in this regard? What I just said. These are the two rules. Accept it, but interpret it rightly, according to reason, lest it be ridiculed. This is one, number 29. Does the fact that the world came to be as it is over a long period of time go against the need to posit a creator? Why or why not? I don't see any reason to posit that. If God is outside time, what does it matter if it was 24 hours in a day, or if each day, I don't know. If you want to, there are people, I think it's a little bit weird, but there are people that try to force what we know about the origin of the universe into the 6 days of creation, like light means energy, and then there was energy for this many billions of years. If you want to do that, go ahead. I guess there's no harm in doing it, but it's a little weird. But there, I mean, the one thing I think is good there is they're not attached to the 24-hour thing. Does it make a difference? No, of course not. If God did it in 24 hours, literally, or if he did it in billions of years, literally, on the contrary, I think doing it over billions of years is more impressive. I don't think 24 hours has anything to do with the creator either way. So that's just my thought on number 29. How can we interpret seed forms in Thomas? Go to page 255. This is a kind of interesting interpretation. The article here, the question is whether it was fitting that the production of plants should take place on the third day. Go to page 255. And this is like 5 lines from the bottom. Other commentators, in accordance with the surface meaning of the text, consider that the plants were produced in act in their various species on this third day. So some people say that the third day, there's actual plants. Augustine says that the earth is said to have produced plants and trees in their causes. That is, it received the power to produce them. Augustine seems to have a background assumption that things took way longer than the book of Genesis depicts, even literally. Because Augustine's saying, no, they weren't actually plants. What Genesis means that let the earth produce plants is that the earth received the ability to, in the future, someday, produce plants. Very interesting. And so a few lines down on page 256. Therefore, the production of plants in their causes within the earth took place before they sprang up from the earth's surface. And this is confirmed by reason. And he gives these reasons why it's confirmed by reason. And so now the propagation of plants, this is quoting Augustine again, from out of the earth is a work of propagation, and therefore they were not produced in act on the third day, but in their causes only. That's a really interesting interpretation. It's not that God actually made the plants on the third day. It's that he made matter capable of someday producing plants. And that's what it means. That's what Genesis is referring to. Very interesting. There's somehow a background assumption, I don't know where they would have gotten this from, that things took way longer than that. They sort of have a kind of primordial theory of evolution in the back of their minds. I find this very, very fascinating, personally. All right. Go to page 259. Let's get to the seed forms. So that's the idea of a seed form. The idea of a seed form. He doesn't say it in this text, but it's in other texts that, and you see it more on page 259. Let's see. Let's go like 8 to 9 lines down. But at the first beginning of the world, the active principle was the Word of God, which produced animals from material elements, either in act, as some holy writers say, or virtually, as Augustine teaches. That's just what we were talking about. Not as though the power possessed by water earth of producing all animals resides in the earth and the water themselves, as Avicenna held, but in the power originally given to the elements of producing them from elemental matter by the power of seed or the influence of the stars. There's these two sort of principles that God put into the natural world. And it's very important that we understand that Aquinas does not consider this a miracle. The creation of life is not a miracle for Aquinas. In fact, he says that somewhere. I wonder if I can find it. Page 243. He's replying to an objection, a few lines down to the reply. It is our business here to inquire how God has constituted the natures of his creatures, not how far it may have pleased him to work on them by way of miracle. The book of Genesis is not about miraculous intervention. It's about nature doing its thing. How does nature do its thing? Go back to this. Power of seed or the influence of the stars. Power of seed is, in matter itself, there are sort of seeds that can later grow into living things, all living things. Now, we're going to talk specifically about the human being later, when John Paul II has some interesting things to say about that. So the power of seed built into matter itself, the way a seed can sort of flower of itself, and the influence of the stars. So there was this sort of primitive notion that somehow the stars have kind of an effect on Earth. However, how can we interpret it right now? Well, matter itself can evolve into life. That's exactly what he's saying, just with different words. Power of the stars, something like what we call the laws of nature. Power of the stars, I mean, it's the thing that causes the tides to move. That's just gravity working. And so Aquinas is saying, well, yeah, life can come about through what's built into matter and with the laws of nature. It's right there in Thomas Aquinas. He's just using different sounds to say the same idea. Okay. What is the language of appearance? This is going to hit even harder. 245. 245, middle paragraph of 245. As, however, this theory, the firmament dividing the waters, literally, can be shown false by solid reasons, it cannot be held to be the sense of Holy Scripture. It should rather be considered that Moses, this traditional author of the book of Genesis, was speaking to ignorant people that were uneducated, simple people, and that out of condescension to their weakness, he put before them only such things as are apparent to sense. Moses deliberately did not say the literal truth in the book of Genesis. He deliberately spoke in sensible, like the language of appearances, because the sort of simple people he was talking to, what do they know about like forces and all kinds of crazy things that are going on in nature? They look up, they see blue. They look at the ocean, they see blue. They look up, they see rain coming down. They look at the ocean, they see water there. And Moses is like, yeah, sure, there's water up there too. Deliberately, not lying, just speaking to their senses. It looks that way. So that's the language of appearance. So it's literal. It's a literal description of the appearance, not the actual reality that's there. The book of Genesis, according to Augustine and Aquinas, is not a cosmology book or a physics book or a biology book. It's about God's saving act in the world. And it's about how God created the world out of love and care and in his goodness. And all that is, there's nothing incompatible between that and any scientific theory that we have today. So this language of appearances in Moses. Does natural causality necessarily exclude the causality of a creator? Why does Aquinas not have any problem with this? Why do I not have a problem saying, oh yeah, the beginning of life is not a miracle? There's no reason, not in the book of Genesis or anything in the Catholic faith, and anything in reason that I've ever seen, there's no reason to think that the beginning of life is something that required a miraculous intervention of God. Why can I say that? Because when nature does stuff, that's God doing stuff too. Nature's first cause is God. And so on the contrary, the more we detract from natural causes, the more of an insult it is to the creator of those natures. And the more we say nature is capable of bringing about life, that's a compliment to the God who created that nature and who is the first cause of nature until now, even now. Okay. So number 32, does it exclude the causality of the creator? None. On the contrary, it requires the causality of the creator. If you take Aquinas's proofs for God seriously, which we're going to get into in another class. Okay. Kind of rushing, but I want to get done before an hour. John Paul II, cute little essay he wrote to this Pontifical Academy for the Sciences. I just want to point out two things. John Paul II sees himself as in a long tradition of popes saying it is perfectly acceptable as a Catholic for you to accept that there's no conflict between evolution and the doctrine of the faith. Okay, bottom of 265. He's quoting Pius XII, who said that in 1950. All right. He does have a couple of warnings. He says, remember, be careful not to apply evolution indiscriminately without reflection to social issues, the way Darwin does by saying poor people should be sterilized. That's one thing he warns against. Okay. Now, he does say, those of you who are Catholics, who are accepting evolution, remember there are two important things to remember. One, page 267, that man is the image and likeness of God. Now, if the body of the human being came about through evolution, he's reminding us that the immortal intellectual soul of each human being, that is directly created by God in every single instance. It has nothing to do with evolution, because evolution is about the evolution of the body. But within these bodies, at conception, God directly creates each human soul in its immortality and its intellectuality. Okay. That, and again, that had really nothing to do with science. Okay. And because of that, the human being should never be used as a means to an end. 267, 5 lines up. Okay. Next page. So the things that we sort of have to still... Yeah, so the 268 is where the body can evolve, but the soul is not something that evolved. Okay. Now, what does he warn us about? Well, don't use human beings as an end. Now, as Catholics, we also have to accept that God created the world. And then the first human parents, whatever that refers to in any literal way, committed some sin. So original sin is something that we have to accept. The fallen state of the human race. Okay. Those are sort of things that now how we reconcile that exactly with evolution, figure it out. That's not something I'm going to explain how I do. Okay. Social Darwinism is a term that developed a little bit later, but is there even in Darwin, which is exactly what I said. The survival of the fittest applied to human civilization. Screw the poor. If you make it, you make it. If you don't, you don't. It's Wolf of Wall Street. It's sterilize the poor. It's eugenics. It's even sometimes racism, that these races are greater than other. Dumb stuff like that is social Darwinism. How is it developed? In a lot of different ways in our society. That's something I'll let you guys reflect on. Among the things that a lot of us sort of are aware of is that the founder of Planned Parenthood was unbelievably racist and deliberately wanted to abort as many minority children as she possibly could. Until now, there is a very large proportion, much larger proportion of Planned Parenthood clinics in poor and ethnically minority neighborhoods than there are in rich white neighborhoods. It's a fact. That's one way it's evolved. Other ways, well, just think of capitalism itself. If you sort of let it do its thing, let the market decide, is sort of saying, like, let natural selection decide. And if the market decides that you're poor and you're not going to eat today, the market has spoken. I think that's another example of social Darwinism. So I'll let you guys kind of reflect on that. I think that is all I want to say today. Any questions or comments on this, we'll talk about them in class. And the next week, Heisenberg review and the final. See you when I see you.